Well, thank you, Monica, for having me. This school is becoming full of friendly faces, John, Perry. So I want to say a couple of full disclosure comments before I start with my thing. One is my presentation goes roughly around 19 minutes. I put it together last night in the red-eye flight. So I could go a second round and try to make it fit in 15, but I was too tired. I said, okay. So what I'll do is I'll stay quiet for 4 extra minutes when we have the discussion, so I give the 4 minutes back. The second thing I want to make a full disclosure is I always think this kind of symposium with these titles and so on, they're always a little bit intimidating to me because I really don't think about these things ever. The only two things I can tell you about the future and technologies is the future will happen somehow. I just hope to be there for a long time in the future. And technology hopefully will keep developing toys that they become useful for us to keep speculating at what ultimately is what I've been interested. And I will be the first one to admit that the evolution of the work that we will produce in the office in the last 10 years and through teaching and many other venues, it has been incredibly related to technology and the technique that imply in relation to that technology, but on the other hand, without any kind of a sense of any religious approach to it. Actually, I will say I have a completely immoral and almost unethical relation with technology. As corrupt as we can make it, the better. I live in Los Angeles, so all that things suit us great. So basically, just to give you a couple of cents, the work that we were doing always has been pregonating on very simple ideas. They have to do with the production of what I call an awkward or misfit notion of aesthetic and a different kind of sensibility with a kind of a clear control of the disciplinary knowledge. The other thing I will mention is I didn't know that the Skype thing was available. And I'm going to start doing hire people with British accents to do my presentation because it's so cool. And with my Spanglish, I cannot compete with that. But I'll keep that in mind from now on. I'll just do a Skype and hire some Hollywood actor to do the presentation. Anyway, so let's get the show. Nothing that we can do about the light because all the backgrounds is going to look incredibly bad because it's all black background, most of them. So anyway, most of them with a few exceptions. As I was saying, the technique has been what drives more of the relation and the kind of ambition what the technology has been evolving, and my fascination has to do much more with the image of as a vehicle for the production of form as a way to replace geometry. I think in the last 15 or 20 years, there have been a couple of critical shifts in the way that we think and we produce architecture. My fascination has been with a kind of a more straightforward, frivolous relation with that. We have to do the incredible power of the image as that vehicle. The other thing which, well, that doesn't look good. The other thing that to me is incredibly interesting, and I think some of the presentations already touch on that, is I always have the feeling that architecture is an incredibly insecure discipline. So we always try to borrow apparatus of mechanisms of argument. And the current trend in relation with technology has been a kind of pseudo-scientific argument. But I think at the same time, that's a really powerful and interesting idea because I think we always misread that. And we never fully understand, so we do always crappy science, crappy mathematics, and crappy, and so on and so forth. But in that interaction, some really interesting kind of mixtures of conditions start to happen. To me, as I said, the idea always has been much more simpler. They all float around 2 or 3 things. We have to do with a kind of affective condition of the production form or a kind of extreme excessive formalism and can have the capacity to produce a different kind of emotional interaction with the audience. Now, I think affect is a word that has been misused a lot in the last many years, and I'm gonna do another version of misuse of that, but to be more specific, ultimately what I think the word always has been after is about a sense of arousal, or to see if architecture can have the capacity to produce a series of conditions that make us react in a particular or alternative way. But at the same time, the other thing which to me has been incredibly revealing about the notion of technology and these mechanisms is they start to produce a very specific aesthetics and a very specific series of interaction that it didn't fit with the traditional canon or how the discipline was operating. So for me, the notion of grotesque and the horrific became useful tools as an alternative way to produce alternative means of the production of what I call beautiful conditions. Not necessarily beauty, but beautiful conditions. And the distinction is that in most of the projects that I'm showing to you, they relate to the problem of the grotesque or the horrific, and I will say the grotesque is kind of an emerging quality that you cannot control, and it can be a direct byproduct of those techniques and technology as a kind of interaction. So it's almost the opposite of cute. I mean, if somebody says, look, I have a friend I want to introduce you, and you ask, well, is she or he beautiful? And the other person says, well, he or she is cute. You know that you're meaning something else. You have to work with other qualities, you have to do with other conditions. So for me, grotesque is the opposite of that. Now, the horrific is a different ball game, and I think it's something that can be choreographed and articulated. And I think in that sense, the work starts to become more precise, and then is when you start to appropriate the technology and the means of what you're trying to work. In our case, as I was saying, cinematic strategies and productions of images to the vehicle for the production of form. Now, the horrific to me, at the end of the day, is nothing different than an alternative way to access to a notion of beautiful, which is a temporary, much more ephemeral quality and so on. The interesting thing which I realized, and this is a research that was done by MIT, and every time that we throw the word MIT is legit, except we're not there now, which he brings some illegal condition to MIT, but which is there's a series of studies that people like to get scared in movies or roller coasters and so on, because the brain liberates a chemical reaction very similar to the sexual orgasm. So basically, people go to see horror movies to get laid, which is a very interesting notion in terms of the reaction of these conditions. So by accident, you start to articulate that those things relate to each other. But what I'm trying to say is the interaction for me in relation with techniques and technology always has to be much more driven with an ambition or kind of a design agenda. And in that sense, I would argue that I'm much more traditional architects than some of the colleagues and people who are presenting here who have a much more, let's say, committed and precise relation to the problem of technology. To me, mine, as I said, is much more in the way than a filmmaker or cinematic condition work, which is a much more corrupt attitude toward that. It's much more, it's all about the final conditions of effects and the final vehicles, and the final qualities that the formal configuration will have. And it has to be clear by now that I'm one of the guys that think architecture is about form, then form follows form, autonomy of form, and so on. It's clear that we don't care that much about people, and it's clear that I don't even have an obsession with materiality. I mean, materials and technology of that is something like it always comes as an afterthought. We try to, don't get me wrong, we try to build as much as we can, we try to fabricate as much as we can, but it's never much of a factor in the production of the work. I think we always try to liberate that for as many preconditions that we have. I'm not saying that with pride. I don't say it's the right way to do, and I think if you're a student of architecture, you shouldn't do that, but it's what I have, and I work with what I have. The other thing which I forgot to mention in PS1, going back to the British accent, is for those of you who are students in the audience, is every time you go to a competition, you have to bring a British engineer, or at least somebody who has a British accent. I mean, it really reassures clients that the thing will work. I think if in Europe, I think a German accent also will work well. But I think in America, the British engineers give you much more cred. And the other thing I want to say to you guys, students, thank you for being here on a Saturday afternoon. That proves your commitment to architecture and technology, or that your social life sucks. In any case, I'm saying those things because I'm running out of interesting things to say. Plastic surgery and mutations, and that's I will say the third, the one before last leg of the 4 points I want to make. One is the notion of cellular organizations and cellular growth that we borrow from fake science and fake movies and so on. It has become very useful for us because it allows us to develop a whole series of families of projects. One thing that the methodology I think is incredibly important. I don't think meanings are that important or pre-meanings are that important, or moral aspects are not important, but methodology, I think, are important in the way that you control how you work and how you can control the evolution of your own work and how you can manufacture chairs or start to play with something else. But the idea to work with families of projects, the idea that you cannot work only in one project, but you work in multiples and you can create different scales after the same kind of a system of organization, to me is a really compelling one, and I will say the computational work to me is, in terms of computational work, that's one of the most interesting contributions that I'm fascinated with, which is this sense of a scaleless that some of this software has. This idea that you don't have a predetermination of what the things are, but the relation need to be established among themselves, and not so much why, because it's the site or the program or the budget or none of those things that it seems like we are not able to deal with that in any case. So the whole notion of cinematic conditions, for example, animation software, for me was very useful because originally I wanted to be a filmmaker, not an architect. So to me, that was an opportunity to start to integrate those two logics. And I think the shift from representation to simulation, I think, is one of the beautiful contributions, and also in the current state of affairs. And the idea that we can use animation not as a vehicle to show the project, but as a vehicle to generate the project and to think almost like a theatrical quality to think about the problem of forms and space. This is for the Hammer Museum exhibition on John Londner. They invite 4 architects, and each of us, we need to add a 30% extension. We got the chemosphere that appears in James Bond movies and so on. So we thought that it was not evil enough. So we add a prosthesis to make it look more evil. So a proper evil man can use it now. Okay. And now we keep going on the rhythm. So the aspect of mutation and how these things start to interact, I think it slowly brought us to the problem of friction and misfit. And I think, to me, in terms of the evolution of the genre and the evolution of the species, which is something that's much more interesting in species versus type, and the way when we work in a product design or a museum scale or an awful tower project that we did for Dubai, this is one of the worst things that we've ever done, or an art installation for Selfridges in London. The principle of what interests me a lot right now, or what is the main, at least the challenge for me in the work on the office, but I would argue is a challenge for technology in relation to design, is the condition of misfit. I think through the evolution of the software, we produce incredible sense of continuities and a smooth transformation of incremental variations. To me, it's much more interesting right now the possibility of misfit, the possibility that you can work with more than one cellular system, that you can work with more than one species at the time, and some kind of a condition of interaction between them can start to happen. So it's not really embedded in an old tradition of collage, neither in a notion of continuous variation and incremental transformation that I would say is one of the parts that interests me the less in terms of scripting on parametric, which is not the case of some of Mark, that we'll talk today, he's an example of how to do that in a very clever way, but I'm talking about the ones that they go in kind of a religious approach. But to me, the problem of misfit and the problem of interaction between two not opposite conditions, but not natural conditions, and create a new series of relationships is, to me, where the ball game is, and is where I'm investing all my time in the next 3 or 4 years to try to figure out that problem. I don't say that we have, but the idea that the relation between the part and the whole can collapse into a much more complex relation in which each part is a whole and the whole is made out of parts, but you can read the part, but the part belongs to a larger, and so on and so forth, and it becomes almost like one of these metaphysical conversations, is where I think the nature of the problem is. Now, as a footnote, and in more specific terms in relation with my own body of work, or the work of the office, is it has to do with also, which is something that fascinates me about architecture, which is different in other fields, is I'm absolutely convinced that architecture has zero capacity to produce newness or new. I think architecture at best can produce different levels of innovation, and always is kind of in a kind of a continuous loop going back and forth and so on. So into this misfit quality, the one that we were exploring right now, and the last 3 projects that you're going to see, in 3 seconds of my official time is over, so I'm gonna go over those 4 minutes. We have been looking at a little bit on romanticism and going back to some of those kind of over-the-top, borderline kitsch qualities as a way to start to throw a certain level of discomfort into the logic of the work. And basically, this is something that we started to develop mostly in product design. I mean, we're doing a series of things for Alessi, Noel, Vitra, and all those guys, which, and art museums. We don't have that many architecture commissions, with the exception of one, for some reason. But what I discovered is the product design, they don't trust us neither. So it's not like because it's smaller, they're gonna let us do it. It still is too expensive, it still is too complicated. Still there is another market for it, which for me is surprising because I always think that there is a big market of perverts out there, that they will find this silverware for a different kind of use. But in any case, they don't seem to agree, so we are developing a series of other versions of stuff. Let me see if we can get this thing. Can you get it out there? There we go. So from a corkscrew to a bottle cover to cigar cutters or glass. So one of these will make his way out, but it doesn't matter. That's not the point of the conversation today. But as I was mentioning, this notion of misfit and try to combine different kind of territories, to me, is where I think any sort of future lies. And I think that, to me, is a challenge for technologies, that they can't find a way to produce more individual differentiation and less, let's say, territorial differentiation, which I would say I've been a promoter of it, so I don't, I mean, I'm not exculpating myself of that. I mean, I think architecture, we are incredibly contradictory, and I think it's one of the disciplines that you can see the most evolution of age in any of the architects, like midlife crisis, I mean, architects, they take it to heart. So we all start to challenge what we were talking 5 years ago. But because nobody really cares that much, so nobody remembers what we said. So that's fine, with the exception of a couple of canonic figures, which certainly am not one of them. So this is getting too boring and too long, so sorry about that. Let's see if we can get out of the product design. That's the cigar cutter, which is my favorite just because I smoke cigars. The rest I don't care much. But this thing I was saying about the misfit and the words, somebody like Alexander McQueen, that he would use the latest technology to produce the most romantic and disturbing images, and the notion that in anger and horror there is a kind of a beautiful condition is what lies. I mean, we're doing this kind of a torture collection of furniture, the chairs and a certain kind of experiments that we've been doing with some of the guys in the office and in the school in SciArc to start to develop this kind of a mutant nature, artificial romanticism. I almost done, I promise. If not, Evan can give you back a couple of minutes. I mean, actually, he's responsible for all this. He was my first teacher in Columbia, so I blame it on him. And so this is a couple of small installations that we did in the last 3 or 4 months, making these flowers, and they grow and die, and actually they affect the technology, and the humidity change all the screens, and the plastic start to corrode. Unfortunately, I don't have any pictures of now, but now it looks awful. It's all black and it smells awful. Nobody can go into the gallery. And that mutates into a series of display systems that we're developing for a traveling show for a museum in Europe. And the last thing I think that is coming, this is a stupid competition. But we put the sky for the first time. I know you noticed we never put the sky, but I couldn't get myself to do a blue sky. The last project I'll show you is the only project that I will not say that is dead, but certainly is in coma. And we're trying to see if we can keep it alive for a little bit longer. It's a small museum for the Thyssen collection, and it's supposed to happen in Patagonia, in Argentina. And it's part of this kind of what I would call techno-romanticism, with flowers and plants growing into the metal, which I was really happy about it until Frank Gehry, when I showed to him, these are the models, and I thought he would say whatever he would say. He have always the most pragmatic questions and answers. I said, but it's not going to work because the metal will get too warm and the flowers will die. That was the only comment that he said. He didn't say it's insane, the structure doesn't work, it's too expensive, whatever. He just said, no, it's not going to work because the metal will kill the flowers. And that was part of an installation that we just did in the Venice Biennale for the Austrian Pavilion. And the last thing is the movie of that. And on that, I'll stay quiet. And after this, Tyler Durden, alter ego, Edward Norton, will tell you what I think about the future and technology. You can see we have a flavor for almost a Liberace kind of architecture. That would be a commission, the Liberace Museum. I think we can skip to the next one because this one goes forever. So I think the future is going to be fine. But if we can get the movie to work.
The support. I'm really okay. Trust me. Everything's going to be fine.
Thank you.